first sort of question we talk about counterplan theory is the question of what the counterplan is. And this is a bit more controversial a question than people might think. Does anyone have just a broad conception of a counterplan they want to throw out here? Okay, fine, I'll do it. As I was thinking, there are broadly three conceptions of counterplans. The first is that the counterplan is an opportunity cost. That is, if we do the plan, we couldn't do the counterplan, and the counterplan is so much better. This view kind of treats the counterplan as a disadvantage, with the plan text generating uniqueness. That is, we can fiat that this is so as a sort of test of uniqueness. Then the mutual exclusivity functions as the link. If I throw out a term that somebody doesn't get, just wave, then I'll happily stop and explain. So the mutual exclusivity functions as the link, and the net benefit is the impact that because we've done your plan, we can't do this other thing, which we can make happen through fiat and has all these sweet advantages and is better than your plan. Now, I think associated with each conception of the counterplan is an associated conception of fiat. And with the opportunity cost counterplan, a conception of fiat that's really being deployed is that we get to test the uniqueness of our opportunity cost, which is kind of a weak conception of fiat. If the counterplan is nothing more than a disad, then why does having an advocacy remove from it the burden of uniqueness? There's just not a real clear answer to that question. There are certainly justifications for negative fiat in general, but viewing the disad as an opportunity cost, I think, runs a negative into problems in terms of why they get fiat, and they have to employ a sort of alternate justification. We'll get to it in a bit. The second conception of a counterplan is that of an affirmative defense. This is a legal term. Like an insanity plea or a plea of self-defense, this is a plea which argues for the innocence of the client based on some alternate means. So in the courtroom model, the resolution is sort of the charge against the status quo, who's the defendant, and the negative as defense attorney deploys some alternate justification. That is, the status quo isn't flawed because of the problems identified in the resolution, or the problems identified in the plan. The status quo is guilty for some separate reason, and if we prove that, then we can illustrate that the charges brought forth in the resolution aren't so. And so in this sense, again, we can conceptualize that the negative fiat is used to test the affirmative defense. So we can speculate as to whether or not this other action that is mutually exclusive with whatever the charges of the resolution is superior, would fix more harm, would deflect more guilt or absorb more guilt in the court analogy. And then the net benefit becomes the justification for the alternate hypothesis proposed by the counterplan.
Mark, would an example of that maybe, try to help me understand here, would an example of that maybe be, okay, it's not the embargo, Cuba's not in trouble economically because of the embargo, it's because of their flawed economic policies.
Yeah, so
it's not the fault of the embargo, it's the fault of the Cubans.
Right, and if you had some counterplan that was exclusive, I'm trying to think of a good example. I suppose Cuba unilaterally opening its markets if there was some piece of evidence that I guess that like Castro gets one policy: he can either engage the United States or he can lift or he can liberalize his own economy. Then yeah, that would be a good example of an affirmative defense. That there is a larger explanation for the problems identified by the affirmative than the cause identified by the affirmative. Is it okay? Okay. The third and most broad conception of counterplans, which is probably the most in vogue right now, is the counterplan as a reciprocal proposal. That there are instances where people decided in general the status quo is indefensible, that there is no way that any moral person could be called upon to justify the practices going on in the status quo, and so the negative needs some other way to engage the affirmative that gives them access to reciprocal power of fiat to construct some other means of solving the problem and sort of change the parameters of the debate, because being asked to defend the status quo would force them to defend morally awkward, not worse than morally awkward, morally reprehensible positions like racism or homophobia good, or genocide acceptable, things like that. That in those instances, the negative needs some other means of arguing, because simply put, the alternative is to force them to make morally reprehensible claims. And this is definitely the broadest interpretation of what a counterplan is. It encompasses the most kinds of things, and that may be the reason why it's in vogue. But this is the idea of counterplans most often, I suppose, deployed. And it's again the one that gives them the negative the most latitude. So yeah, questions about types of counterplans, categories of counterplans, methods of understanding them? Okay, then let's move into a couple of sort of broad counterplan questions that are pretty common in theory debates. I kind of want to move through these a little bit quickly, because I think there are more interesting strategy concerns to talk about a little later. And I think that these are arguments that have been around for a long time, and there are arguments that occur in the round every time. There's not really a good right or wrong answer. Okay, so the first question related to the conception of the counterplan is, whence comes negative fiat? The idea most often deployed here is that the counterplan is a way to just falsify the resolution. It's no different than any other negative argument, and so the affirmative, in order to test the truth of the resolution, gets to use the word should and sort of engage in a thought experiment to understand a world in which the status quo is fundamentally altered by some proposal. So the inverse of that should not does not entitle the negative to reciprocal rights. That there is literally no resolutional basis for negative fiat, and the idea of sort of inventing fiat is really problematic if there's no justification for it, there's no limits on it. I mean, the resolution ties the affirmative to one actor and ties the affirmative to things that actor can realistically do. There's no such constraint on the negative's imaginary fiat, which would justify things like object fiat, which would justify things like multi-actor fiat or utopian fiat, which does seem to be problematic. That's if you're going with the disadvantage as an affirmative defense or an opportunity cost. That's the kind of conception of fiat that's being offered. Well, less with the opportunity cost, but that's the general conception. The most common sort of response to this is the idea of reciprocity, that the negative gets to make the same kind of fiat claims as the negative does. That if multi-actor fiat and object fiat and utopian fiat are bad for the affirmative for reasons of grounds and fairness, then the same holds true for the negative, right? That the negative shouldn't be entitled to make terrible claims to fiat just because they're not bound by a resolution. They should still get some right to fiat because of the idea that the status quo is indefensible, but the same kind of theoretical limits are placed in that fiat. It has to be a fair fiat. We'll get into how that functions in a round a little bit later.